Seattle, and I do various educational programs for students and teachers around the U.S. The website, economicthinking.org, I'll give you some website addresses where I have some of the materials I'll be talking about today. First, a little bit about my background. I have my degree in economics from the University of Washington in Seattle. And when I was at the University of Washington, I had a very strong economics department with lots of market-oriented economists, and particularly strong in economic history. Doug North was chairman of the department, and there were 4 or 5 other economic historians, and the project was applying economics to history, trying to get a better sense of history through economics. My interest since then has been in development economics, which is really very much the same story as economic history. We're trying to study what institutions, what policies help explain economic development, economic growth. So today's what I'm going to cover in my presentation here. Going to be some similar things that you've heard in other presentations, the importance of institutions, and a fair amount about migration. I was here last year in Budapest, speaking at a couple forums, and my program there drew from a book called From Poverty to Prosperity by Nick Schultz and Andrew Kling. And what this book does is really draw from a variety of economists, from Douglas North, Joel Boyker, others that work in institutional economics. And the effort is, I would argue, that these economists have insights that are valuable, and on our website, the New Europe, if you use that, you can get an interview with Nick Schultz and various links and materials from that presentation. But the book has a lot of interviews. In fact, there's a new version of it with a new title coming out in just a month, less expensive, so that's going to be available. But one of the sort of the core issues in there is discussed in a recent magazine article, the subject of intangible capital. We're trying to study why some countries are more prosperous than others, what's encouraging economic growth. They cite a World Bank study that tries to measure capital, measure prosperity. And what they found was, natural capital accounted for something like 5% of total wealth in a country, the natural resources, the machinery, the technology, the training. But intangible capital was 77% of wealth. And by intangible capital, as you can guess by the name, it's intangible. It's something that's hard to measure. And they use the term recipes or protocols, the sort of things that, when you register a new company or trying to do a business transaction, is it easy or is it complicated? And these institutional systems are central to the workings of a market economy. We watched a video last night called The Power of the Poor with Hernando de Soto, and it was basically on the same subject. Hernando de Soto was comparing Switzerland to Peru and trying to find out, investigating the legal institutions in Peru that made it so difficult for people to prosper. And his organization, the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, basically goes out into the communities and tries to do research to find out how they actually do things, how they do business transactions, what the everyday people use for the legal system. And the theme is that laws emerge, legal systems emerge from the everyday practices of people going about the daily life of living, growing food, trading, making clothes. And this is a whole separate world than what the government legal system is. The legislature passes laws, Parliament passes laws, they make rules. Whether people follow those rules or not, depends on how much pressure the police put on them and what the incentives are. But the Soto's argument is there's an informal legal system that emerges that's different from place to place. There's a sort of a natural law that's similar across cultures, but in the U.S. it was called the law of the land. That the legal system was different in Virginia than it was in Massachusetts because people had lived there for a couple centuries and more people came in and traditions were just slightly different. In the West, there was less water than in the East, so water law was different in the West and the East. And it wasn't water law passed by the government. It was sort of common law tradition, law of the land that people developed as they just again went through their lives. So in The Power of the Poor and in Globalization at the Crossroads, they look at this project in the developing world of trying to measure what the actual legal systems are that people use on their own, and they sort of call these informal systems, and they're trying to formalize those, trying to codify or make sense of those. There's also Globalization at the Crossroads, which is the second half of that documentary. On the screen here are various videos that are done by Free to Choose Media and Izzit.org, IZZIT.org is where they sell those to public schools and market them. So you can find some of those online, bits and pieces of them from those websites. The two Johan Norberg videos are just coming out, I guess, in the next couple of months. So, this idea of legal systems developing from the bottom up, you know, it's a core issue in economics, how you, where these legal systems come from. I wanted in my presentation talk about that part of the time, and then talk about two recent books. One's called Triumph of the City by Glacier, and the other's called Rival City, How the Largest Migration in History is Reshaping Our World by Doug Saunders. In both of these books, they just look at the operation of the city. One of the Suit de Tracy, the French economist, his work on economics, he argued that cities are basically places of exchange. Exchange cities, huge number. He said you could sort of describe all social order as a series of exchanges. But in cities where you've got more people, you've got a deeper division of labor, more specialization, and the excitement and the advances of cities. I guess one way to talk about this, people often think in terms of nations, right? Nation states. The United States, France, Germany. But that's an aberration, I would argue. That's a mistake. Instead, we're better off talking about cities. In the United States, one way to look at this, in the United States, the story of the 80s and 90s was how powerful California was. California, the 8th largest economy in the world, it's an incredible boom in California, but now they're in trouble and declined a bit, and Texas is taking off. And you hear a lot about how Texas, over half the jobs created in the entire country are created in Texas. But really, even that's a mystery. The success of California was not the state of California. The state of California was everywhere and always hampering economic growth and making things difficult. The boom and excitement in California was in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, the huge megalopolis that goes, you know, almost from Los Angeles to San Diego, and also in the Bay Area. San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, huge numbers of businesses in these regions. Agriculture was very strong. In Texas, the incredible dynamism in Texas is about the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Houston area, San Antonio, and Austin. These are incredibly entrepreneurial areas, full of companies, enterprises, vast immigration in these areas. It's stunning immigration a couple decades earlier in Los Angeles, and the immigration now in Texas. But so the idea of entrepreneurship, economic growth, it's not nation states, it's cities. And there's a long history of that, and that's what I want to talk about. Rival City is a book looking at the incredible migration to cities around the world, in Africa, in India, in China. One of the chapters I just read recently is on Istanbul, stunning immigration into Istanbul over the last 50 years. It's made this incredibly powerful economic city, and it was done, again, without some modest things done by government. Government decided not to shoot people, which was very much appreciated. They built some roads and infrastructure. They had this large-scale immigration from rural Turkey over a couple of decades in shanty towns all around Istanbul. And after conflicts and various concerns and issues, the government finally gave up and said, look, you can have your property. They basically gave property to everyone who had established themselves in the shanty towns around Istanbul, and that all of a sudden all these revolutionaries became homeowners. And they sort of lost interest in the revolution and got interested in improving their homes, starting their business, they were able to get capital from getting loans on their houses and so forth. the same story that Hernando de Soto was talking about around Lima, of the huge migration into Lima, and people gaining the rights to their property and then starting businesses. That story happens around Turkey. That story happens in the developing world around these various cities. In Triumph of the City, one of the reviews of that, and that again looks at cities in the U.S. as well as around the world, the author has a line about it. Says there's a lot to like about the shanty towns in Africa. And that's, that gets the attention of people because they seem like the most horrible places in the world, but instead, they're places of dynamism and opportunity, and for the people that migrate there, those cities, the shanty towns, are better than where they left. They're better than rural areas. The access to water is better, the job opportunities are better. So anyway, these two books are about the tremendous growth of cities and the spontaneous order, that is the self-organizing systems where people get together, they set up their own governance systems, they build their own houses, they set up their own neighborhoods, and the state is playing a very little positive role in that. So let me background a little bit on how I got into this topic. Another book I highly recommend is called Money Markets and Sovereignty, and this is a book in defense of globalization, as well as a discussion of monetary policy and arguing that the state government shouldn't have control of their monetary systems. It's a tremendous book written by published by the Council on Foreign Relations, which is not generally known for radical free market publications, but it's highly recommended. I spent much of the last year doing lectures on U.S.-Russia relations and on the history of Russia. And in the start of that, I started studying, two cities which were deep in Russian history, Moscow versus Novgorod. And Novgorod I'd never heard of before, began researching that and finding out more. And it turns out that in the early days of Russia, Moscow was a city-state, Novgorod another city-state, but Novgorod's institutions were dramatically different than the Oriental despotism of Moscow. Novgorod, the first and only republic in Russia, turns out that Novgorod was a city in the Hanseatic League, which is a league of trading cities throughout the Baltics. I have some handouts for you here. You should have, some notes from Leonard Liggio on the Hanseatic League from a presentation he did at the Montpellier Society meeting. But basically, again, we think of European history, we're sort of taught about the history of, France versus Germany versus Holland, these different city-states. But for centuries of European history, without states, there were cities, and these cities were sort of run by merchants. Novgorod, all citizens participated in the government. The legal institutions were in a central assembly where people would declaim the rules and institutions. Every citizen, wealthy or poor, had a role in the governance of the city. They had separate institutions. And this is similar to the early Greek city-states. The idea of a common assembly where everyone had a role in the city-state. Now, I'm not claiming that Novgorod in the 11th century was an ideal libertarian utopia or anything like that. But separate from Moscow, we have the stories of cities and the stories of a free city, a trading city. And the earlier book that I mentioned, or showed there, Property and Freedom, Richard Pipes, it's a fascinating book. And he argues that the trade created the law. Governments were legitimate only if they defended the laws that were already existing. Government didn't create laws, the laws were there, the laws were part of the trading institutions, and the sort of fascinating history of property rights and freedom. And in cities and trading areas, you need to have clear ideas of who owned what. And so the contracts and property rights developed very much with trade. So, Novgorod, founded by, and I spent the whole year pronouncing it Novgorod because I had a deeper sort of Russian sound to me, but somebody pointed out that pronouncing it wrong the whole year, so too bad. Now all these students are pronouncing it wrong, so. Anyway, founded by Vikings in the 9th century, and the idea is part of the Hanseatic League. They escaped, for various reasons, they escaped the Tartars, but the quote here, there's a central assembly and all freemen of Novgorod, regardless of social status, were entitled to participated in its deliberations, and decisions were made by acclamation. Again, the Leonard Liggio paper. So for students reforming U.S.-Russia policy, I proposed the Hanseatic League. Turns out there is a Hanseatic League still. They met in 2009 in Novgorod, and it's not clear exactly to me what they do, apart from dressing up in nice outfits. But it's sort of a chamber of commerce, promoting trade between cities and so forth. But really, U.S.-Russia relations would be better between U.S. cities and Russian cities, U.S. people and Russian people. Vladimir Putin had one of the best reform proposals saying get rid of visas. You know, between Russia and the U.S., get rid of visas. Let Russians who want to come to the U.S. to work for business reasons come. The more open movement of people, trade, and investment is better. You know, it's a better thing. Okay, so let me jump back a little bit and argue that these same ideas of city-states, of trade between cities, the benefits of trade, we find in the ancient world. The Greeks, one of many societies with their own traditions, had a strong tradition of being pro-trade. The god Hermes, the god of riches and trade and good fortunes, the Greeks were called upon by their gods to treat travelers well. When a traveler came to your village or your area, you were obligated to be nice to them, to serve them a meal even before you asked who they were. This promotes trade. Murdering travelers and traders and confiscating their wealth does not promote trade. So merchants wanted to go to Greek cities where they were treated well. And travelers bring news, they bring information. When someone comes with goods and services from other areas, that's knowledge that benefits any culture. Trade was a discovery process encouraging technology, innovation, and flow of ideas. Here's a map of the ancient world. The red are Greek city-states, yellow Phoenicians, and you can see they're all over. And if you think of the process in the ancient world, there's people coming from the Greek city-states to distant regions. They're carrying with them goods that the Greeks had produced. They go to a different region and they start trading outposts along the Black Sea, of course, and throughout the Black Sea were these trading outposts. And they begin to trade with people that are, growing food and services and minerals from other parts in those areas. And then they set up a colony there. If things go well, that expands. But if you think about what the colonial process is, it's the Greek city-states establishing daughter city-states, and those are trading with the people in the community or in the region. This is a way of transmitting knowledge and technology around the world, or around the world they can get to. Again, shipping is inexpensive, so they're traveling through these areas where it's inexpensive to get to by boat. But this is a huge increase in population, wealth, and prosperity in the ancient world based around these city-states. Which is interesting because if you in school, when you hear talks about the Greeks, they always say, well, the Greeks, they were great, they did all these things, but they were always squabbling. So the city-states were always squabbling, always fighting, and they couldn't unite to form a common government. It's like the view of modern state worshipers today is that everyone in the ancient world should have had big states just like us. But that's not at all clear that that's the case. They had self-government, city-state by city-state. You had incredible competition among city-states. Their institutions, their trade institutions, family institutions, institutions for welcoming citizens and immigration. Athens, people could be artisans, could become citizens, and Athens gave Athens a huge advantage over other city-states that didn't allow that. But you had competition among, divergent legal institutions as well as economic institutions. So the climate varies from place to place. Trade encourages communities to cooperate. There's division of labor. Again, this promotes economic growth and prosperity through the ancient world. Huge benefits as you spread this knowledge across the ancient world. And water was the key to this. There's another chart, and this one shows, where timber is coming from, gold and silver, wheat, different areas, and what was being traded along these trade routes. But water was the key to this because it was inexpensive to trade across the water, 100 times cheaper than over land. Moving forward a few centuries to the Middle Ages, you have the trading empires of Venice and Genoa and the Hansa, And these are, again, trading cities, tremendous trade going along this area. And it's not just goods and services going back and forth. It's knowledge, it's information, it's technology moving from area to area. It's interesting in this time, looking at the early, you hear anti-globalization people today complaining about transnational corporations. Well, the early transnational corporations were the monasteries. I'm not sure they want to be described as transnational corporations, but this is, what's that?
It's okay.
Okay. The Cistercian monasteries were very engineering and science oriented. There's in this book, The Medieval Machine, a discussion of the 12th century report of just one of the monasteries, and the whole thing was in a sense an industrial factory. The monks were using water power for crushing wheat, seeding flour, fulling cloth, and tanning. And it wasn't just a particular monastery that had this industrial, supporting the farmers in the area, being sort of a mini early city. But you could repeat the same story 742 times, because that's the number of Cistercian monasteries that were spread around Europe. So the technology and knowledge was developed in one location, and then they sent missionaries off to another location, and they took the knowledge of how to build the water wheels, how to run the operations. That supported, and knowledge about agriculture, that supported the local farmers in the area. They specialized in different things and trade between the monasteries. And this was a tremendous advance of technology. You wonder how Europe got so far ahead of China and India. Part of the process was this large trade and the way the monasteries spread information and knowledge and technology across Europe. At its height, the Benedictines had 37,000 monasteries across Europe. Each one, according to this book, was sort of an agricultural college for the whole region. The Cistercian monasteries transferred factory knowledge. All this information that was developed in different areas was spread to other areas. Ideas and goods were exchanged. This brings me to there's a great quote that Michael Cox used about the sort of the story of industrialization in the last couple centuries. He has the example of, imagine 5 people are dropped into a jungle and only one of them has a machete. And that one with the machete, has a huge advantage. He's got a tool and he can hack his way out of the jungle and make a trail and go far ahead of the others. But once the others find the trail, they can run even faster and catch up. So in a sense, England and the early industrialization in England and France, Germany, they had tools, technology they developed, but once that success is there, you can just catch up, right? The factories that work, nobody else has to go through the same long, grinding industrial revolution. Instead, you have newer factories, better machines, you copy those institutions that support that. And so this movement that went through Europe centuries ago, we have a similar movement going through the world since the Industrial Revolution in England. Now, not uniform, not everywhere, and obviously held up by a long time by communism, fascism, and other things. This recent article, Leonard Liggio sort of started his Hanseatic quote after seeing a headline at UK Nordic Summit aims to forge a free market ties. And it says, for the first time ever, these cities are uniting to form this free market network. And Leonard's point is, no, it's not the first time ever. They did it 1,000 years earlier, or centuries earlier, with the Hanseatic League. And again, a network of cities that are trading. So, what institutions allow these cities to prosper? What allowed this to work in Hanseatic times? Well, moving this to the present, you have the story of charter cities. And I've given some talks on this. You can find this information, Economic Thinking /Charter Cities. The Global Envision website has an article on Paul Romer and his Charter Cities proposal. Basically, the Charter Cities proposal, we spent all this time trying to promote development around the world, Africa and other countries, with foreign aid, with all sorts of convoluted programs, our corrupt government supporting their corrupt government, aid agencies involved. But what Paul Romer suggests is going to a country and sort of working on the idea of a free trade zone. Free trade zones have been developed where you've got a certain region where you allow free trade within that region, or you let them reduce trade barriers and others. So the proposal that he says is, well, take an area next to, some unpopulated area where you can buy the land. You go in and you buy a square mile of land somewhere, build an international airport there, build a port facility, but get agreement from the local government to have a voluntary society there where a separate contract governs, a charter governs the city. And that maybe sounds radical or unusual, but he says, no, this is, if you look, who are some of the wealthiest places today are charter cities. Hong Kong, Singapore, early charters set up these cities. Now, wasn't done exactly fairly, gunboat charter cities, not what he's proposing. But in the Atlantic Monthly, there's a great essay describing the Paul Romer proposal. And it starts by looking at King Henry the Lion, who had just taken over some territory and was devastated, and how we going to promote economic growth. And this is the area of Lubeck, and what he does is to attract people to that. He devised a charter, and he said to the merchants, if you set up in this region, you can have your own legal system, you can have your own governance system. I want 5%, some percentage of revenue, but you can do what you want there. You won't be subject. You'll have free trade throughout the kingdom. And this becomes sort of a trading fair with permanent residents, and it becomes incredibly popular. This charter gets copied, and soon there's a couple charter cities, dozens of charter cities, and I actually don't know the total number of cities in the Hanseatic League. It was like a secret. It would seem strange. You'd think you couldn't keep a city secret. But basically, these were cities that had a network that allowed trade between each other. They weren't perfect. They were keeping out other cities. But the idea is, if you want, so instead of trying to convince the Nigerian government that they should make their legal system and governance transparent and have a completely open, ideal system, you can try that. Maybe that'll work someday in the 23rd century or something. But in the meantime, you can try and get a set of land someplace in Nigeria and get agreement from the government that within this region, international rules, a charter set up by an outside, maybe it's Canada, maybe it's Hong Kong, the separate charter that governs business relations in that region. Nobody has to live there, nobody has to work there. They come in voluntarily if people want to work. But if you try and figure out how to do that, and that way you're not forcing something on the people of this country. That way it doesn't look imperialistic in quite the same way, although people criticize it. But he's trying to promote this idea of what you need are better legal institutions. By the way, Paul Romer was one of the guys interviewed and discussed in the Poverty and Prosperity book. But he says, let's demonstrate, let's prove that improved legal institutions are the key by setting up charter cities, and the prosperity develops, and that can be a lesson maybe to the rest of the country. So you can find out more about that on his website, chartercities.org. The picture he uses here is a city in Africa where all the kids are doing their homework, and they've all got cell phones, and they've got some technology, but they're on the street doing their homework, because the only place there's electricity and light is on the street lights. In their houses where they live, there's no electricity, so they can't study at night. So if they want to study, they have to go out to the street and sit there. And so why is it that they have cell phones and modern technology throughout Africa, but they can't get electricity, basic electricity to read with in their homes? And Romer argues it's because one is the free market system providing cell service, and the government provides electricity, and it hasn't figured out a way to provide electricity to everyday people. And you can go on the website and find their whole story of charter cities and the different rules and the way they're trying to organize it. One of the articles you've got is an article from the Wall Street Journal about Honduras. The Honduran legislators agreed to have a charter city. So this is a Paul Romer model. It may not eventually get set up. Things can go sideways. But the idea is there's interest in it as a tool for development. So, again, the idea of the role of cities and these institutions, the importance of legal institutions in developing prosperity, and the reality that around the world is this mass migration of people into cities. That's sort of it's true, but people don't see it, and they don't see the import of it. If you you want development, if you allow those cities to work, that's where you're going to get the most development. Charter cities, similar related system of fixing the institutions. There's a travel guy based in Seattle, Rick Steves, who has European travel every week. He has a different show on different places in Europe. And one of his shows is called Rick Steves' Little Europe. And he profiles 5 mini-states, city-states in Europe. And Monaco, San Marino, Liechtenstein, Andorra, the Vatican is another one he looks at. That's sort of a special case. We're looking at these 4. These are sort of leftover charter city-states. And it's, it's interesting how prosperous these are. I'm going to go to the next one. It'll play for just 1 minute, and we'll see if we can get it through our microphone system here, if you can hear it. If we not, I'll stop.
Until little more than a generation ago, Andorra was an impoverished and isolated backwater. Churches date back to the 12th and 13th centuries. Their stony Romanesque bell towers stand as strong as the surrounding Pyrenees. That same local stone is used today as a building boom illustrates how lately the principality has flourished. Since World War II, the population has increased tenfold. Recently, Andorrans have become quite known. The mountains that kept the principality both isolated and poor are now a source of its prosperity. Hiking and skiing are understandably doing business here. And Andorra has those special economic buttons so popular among resident states. Easygoing banking, duty-free shopping, and low taxes. It's worked from rough and tumble smugglers to a high-tech, high-altitude shoppers famous for its low prices. Well, Andorrans speak cut.
Okay, so that's the end of the travel out there. But the idea here's one of these leftover city-state areas. It used to be smuggling up there. The mountains allowed it to not be conquered, and now the mountains are great for tourism. But the model is very small places. Again, Monaco, Liechtenstein, Andorra. These are places that are incredibly prosperous, partly because they don't have nation states. They're cities, not nation states. That's a nice model. How far you can take it, how many other options there are, I don't know. But it's an exciting way to look. And it's in the U.S., free market people try to promote federalism. The federal government, national government having less power, more choices around the country, but really having power in cities, having less governance, more institutions is even better. So, again, I encourage you to take a look at a rival city. You can find out more online. There's a long section of Istanbul, and it is amazing because this is actual reporting where they go out and talk to the guy who moved to the city in 1955. Apparently, they all come in one bus stop, HAREM. They come to this bus stop, and they have for 5 decades. And thousands, tens of thousands of people every year come to this bus stop. They move in. When they first, in the 50s and 60s, they got to Istanbul. There was no place to live, so they just went to an empty valley that was on the side of Istanbul, and they started building their houses. It's all illegal. They were completely squatters, but they just built houses. The police, they built at night, so the police couldn't find them, I guess was the idea. They were working during the day as well. And they eventually built up their little shanty town. The police would come by and try and stop them, but there were so many of them. After a while, it just grew and grew. They had their own governance, own sort of local government, their own associations, their own police security, and it developed not perfectly, but again, a self-organizing community. And now they say if you go to Istanbul, the Istanbul proper is like this theme park on the edge of the new Istanbul, right? Because it has grown so dramatically over the last decades, with areas that were shanty towns are now developed, and it's a fascinating story. It's not perfect, but it's fascinating. But this migration to cities is the same story that America and Europe have. This is what, mass migration into London, into Edinburgh, into Manchester, migration to the cities through the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. In America, America's founding really had so much to do with New York, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, migration to the cities from the countryside. The Horatio Alger series, there's a novelist, Horatio Alger, and his stories much of those are about migration to the cities from the countryside. As agricultural productivity decreased, they needed less workers, people had to leave and go to the cities. In the cities, they're trying to find work, the kids are working, this industrial enterprise, this textile factories built out. It's an amazing story, and it's the story of migration, the way Hernando Soto puts it in his documentary. When he's comparing what's happening in Lima to the history of Europe and America, he said that, you know, America's history and Japan's as well, people migrating to the city, and he uses the phrase, and breaking the back of the old order and establishing their own legal systems. And I think that's a fascinating, the aristocracy, setting up informal legal codes that govern their operations, and it's much the same story around the world it's much the same story. So that these folks are sort of giving snapshots of that, focusing on the legal institutions and trying to find the best way. There's a marvelous segment from Albania, which is much the same story. De Soto was interviewed and said it never occurred to him that the work they started in Lima for the developing world would also be applied in the post-communist world. But they go to, they were called into Albania, and the story in Albania, the researchers basically go out and interview people, but the story in Albania, the government forced people to stay in the villages, so they didn't migrate to the city. You know, they were shot if they came to the city without permission. Once communism fell, immediately huge numbers of people migrated to the city, but the city didn't have legal institutions to allow them to build new buildings or to own new property, so they just started building buildings anyway. So in much of the former communist world, you have buildings that don't have permits on land that isn't properly titled. They tell the story of the papers. People threw away their communist ID cards, but then they don't have certification for who they are. They show a lady who's about to get married, and she needs to have a birth certificate to get married. But to get a birth certificate, she has to go to her home village. Since most people in the city came from somewhere else, they have to go back to the village where there's records of them being born. So, you know, it's a long day's journey out to her home village. She has to wait in line and finally get the birth certificate, and it's only good for 3 weeks. So anytime you want to buy a car, rent an apartment, you know, all your legal documentation, you have to go back to your home village and get these birth certificates every 3 weeks. I gave this talk in Houston, and there was this graduate student there from Eastern Europe, and she asked if that was still true, because the documentary was made a couple years ago. And I said, I don't know. So she checked with a friend from Albania and said, oh no, now we've got the computerized system. So now the computer will print out this information and mail it to you. The guy said, so I did that, and I get this form where it's all printed in the wrong lines and all mixed up, so he has to go back to his home village. So anyway, the problems of documentation, the problem of titling and property rights, the problem of getting a license, everyone's informal because there aren't a business license system. That story in the developing world, in the post-communist world, is a story of trying to fix this. And again, it's not the question of the government passing the best legislation to solve the problem. It's a question of going out and documenting legal institutions that have existed on their own. De Soto has a great line from one of the cities in Africa. He said, the government doesn't, the people live here by the hundreds of thousands, millions, but they don't live on land that they own. They don't have a title to it. But if you go there, there's no doubt about who owns what. The people in the communities consensually agree to whose property is what. And when you hear a dog barking on the street, that dog is defending the property that people have agreed, you know, that person owns. And the dog is your property line in a sense. It's not an ideal system, but instead of imposing something from the top down, you just want to document what systems have emerged and then formalize it. And that's what they do in Tanzania. In one of the segments, they go into Tanzania and they document that these people have these really complex business relationships, building various things, and none of it's legal because the government doesn't have institutions that allow that. Instead, they built their own contracts, they have their own system, and his researchers go in and try and, again, document it, measure it, and try and get the government to accept it. Really, what you're asking for is the government to not shoot people for the voluntary interactions that they do in their daily life pretty above. And the government needs to consider that and see if that's a good idea, but eventually we hope they will.
But the will of the parties can be considered legal.
Yeah, it is, in a sense, it's the rule, it's the law of the land, it is legal. The idea is you don't want the elites to grab the government legal system and use it. This is the story, you know, the revolution in Egypt, a big part of that. The Soros team went in there a decade ago, and they documented that, you know, 90% of the people in Cairo, you know, didn't have title to their property. People that lived in communities, the homes their father or grandfather built, they still didn't have title. Everyone was afraid to improve their house because if they did, someone would knock on the door and claim they owned it, and then you were in, you know, legal disputes in the courts for years and years. It was a huge mess. So De Soto, you know, said, here's the problem, here's how you deal with it. One of the top government ministers said, this is great, this is going to be a new Egypt. It was very exciting, a lot of publicity, and then the minister disappeared, and that was the end of the story. So if you don't fix those problems, you get a revolution, as you got in Egypt, as you'll have in other countries that don't have a way for poor people to enter the legal system. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much. Quick picture of my audience. I need to do a
You can take a picture. You can take a picture here. Come, let's get to take it.
Okay. And so I started with pictures of me lecturing, and of course the pictures of the back of everyone's head and me. Pretty soon my supporters got tired of seeing me in the back of everyone's head. So some pictures in the front looking out too. Okay, you have a question? Yes.
Yes. You know, in Romania we have this problem of many Roma people not having birth certificates, other documents and so on. During the last 10 years there were many discussions, even at the government level or different hubs, think tanks about the situation.
I'm bald headed.
My question now is, wouldn't be enough, as in, for example, paper where I sell something and you buy something, or a partner, yes? Two parties agreement. That the father and the mother would sign a paper that the child is there. Why do we need the city mayor, you know,
I would guess
to issue a birth certificate? Because the real ones who are entrusted to issue a birth certificate are the father and the mother, and that is it.
Every democracy would do is go out and document how they actually establish. First, you know, what essentially is the agreement among the people about who was born at what time. And you find that there are some institutions that they use that the state isn't satisfied with, but is apparently good enough for them. And then you try and document what that is, and then get the state to accept that.
They didn't accept. I've made this proposal many times. The fact is that we have, you know, this situation. Somebody's
Yeah. By the way, I spoke to Christian homeschoolers at seminars in the U.S., and I gave a talk on federal revenue policy. That's a new debate topic. And one of the kids says, well, the way to do it is just stay off the grid. This is a 17-year-old high school kid. You stay off the grid, never start paying income taxes, then you don't have to. He's one of these people who claim you don't have to pay income taxes. And I said, well, there's a lot of people who believe that, and most of them are in jail. So, I mean, you can say you don't have to pay it, but they'll arrest you. And he says, well, don't you just stay in the cash economy, don't pay income taxes? He says, he says, I don't have a social security number, and I don't have a birth certificate. Because his father wants him off the grid. And so he is absolutely invisible without that information. He said, well, it's going to be tough to buy a house, you know, without documentation that you have. And he said, well, if you've got cash, you can buy a house. So I have no idea. There's a whole group of people who have their own, who don't want a state saying, state birth certificate. Their parents don't want the state to know they're there. And these are people that, as we used to say, they like to live liberty, right? Not just talk about it. So I don't know what to say about that, but the argument with the birth certificates there, you would expect some institution to come up, whether it's banks or someone else trying to get them, trying to get their business, offering them that service. You know, birth certificates are us, and somebody starts to...
Cine știe cum se zice declarație de proprietare secundă?
Declaring your own
State by made by yourself.
Yeah, declaration upon your own responsibility. Yeah?
Yeah.
I mean, shouldn't be enough to make this declaration that you were born, even if the parents are not there. You need a witness.
Right. What about the death certificate? Can you give it by yourself?
Yeah. I certify you in that. Yeah, you have a question?
That's what we read in US, that's it.
You have a question?
Yeah, I must, sorry.
Okay. Okay, any other questions on other issues? Yeah.
I would just speak highly of Minnesota as somebody who is an exponent of this bottom-up approach, the registration of titles and all that. How do you perceive his criticism by people like history who say actually this is not a bottom-up approach, this is a top-down approach, it is an attempt to sort of have one universal way of registering property, which actually is not compatible with some like local norms, because sometimes this jointly owned property existed for generations, and by that, like into individualized properties, you actually kill the way these people organize themselves, and you do not necessarily improve their situation.
Yeah, it's a good point. DeSoto was interesting. I mean, he's not all free market. He does things different ways. He tries to. I think the book, The Secret Life of Alejandro Maica, which is a book by Mario Vargas Llosa. I think DeSoto was the guy in there. There's a guy in there who runs a think tank. And you can tell who we got the latest donation. He gets donations from the left and the right. And you can tell who we got the latest big donation from because he attacks them viciously. Balancing the donation. So, I mean, he tries to cover a lot of ground. He tries to do free market reform, but be friendly with leftists. But yeah, I agree that's a problem. You go to the Egyptian government to get them to adopt the right system, and then that can stifle the system that spontaneously developed. And I think it's a sort of compared to what? The system now isn't working, and he says this would be better. The consequences in Peru seem pretty positive. That is, when people got title for their land, they were better off. But I know there's real issues like the titling process of the Kikuyu in Kenya. That the British government, very precise, wanted to make clear who owned what, and they go through and they document that this family owns this plot of land. But it turned out to be a disaster in a lot of ways, because the tradition was this family would own the land except for 2 months when some other family could raise their cattle across it. But when you gave this guy exact title, all of a sudden they blocked out a traditional consensual agreement about property ownership that had developed, again, because it was logical, right? And it's the argument that property rights are expensive to develop, but they develop when they provide a benefit. So I don't know other than that. What he argues now is these huge shanty towns, the sort of chaos with the police arbitrarily blocking things down. He wants to get them more formal, and I don't know if there's a way to get them more formal without too formal or how it's done. You sort of want the judge to discover the law rather than the legislative aid law. And I noticed that when we talked about the hero in Switzerland, who sort of codified all these legal norms, that codified it, that was seen to freeze it. What the argument was by making it so the different parts of Switzerland could trade better, that there was an added improvement there.
Johann Norberg argues in his In Defense of Global Capitalism that Taiwan propelled its growth by land reform, which established titles to land and property, so then their economic growth soared. Do you know the details behind this land reform that occurred in Taiwan? Anything about that?
I don't. I would be sort of worried if the who I'm paying might have got their land. I don't know how that worked. But you have these aristocratic systems. In the US, right, you had this huge chunk of land that was owned by the aristocrats and basically was just taken away from them and assigned to people. And so there's an effort to sort of get rid of the old aristocratic system, and you could argue that they didn't justly own the land in the first place. But the challenge of that kind of land reform is I remember the story from El Salvador, that the reformers came in and took the land from the rich aristocrats and gave it to the farmers, and sort of wondered why things didn't develop. And a quote from one of the farmers as well: if the government can come and take land from the most powerful in the region, they can take it from me too. Once you break that system, there's a lot to stick back. Do you have a question?
I just recently saw like a documentary about Kowloon Walled City. Did you know it?
No.
It was like up until the 80s, there was like this city within Kowloon. It was like a former fortress, like in Hong Kong, Kowloon. And it was like a former British fortress. And the Triads moved in there, I think, after the Second World War. And like it's all like illegals in Hong Kong, like mostly Chinese refugees who didn't have a work permit, lived there and had like their own factories there. You have like factories on 10 square meters, like small workshops. So I think like 40 or 50,000 people lived in there, where it's like the police didn't dare to go in, but like the luxury hotels of Hong Kong were like provided with like products from this like lawless, let's say this government-less or government-free city within the city. And it was like, it totally worked. I mean, they had like their own informal institutions, and the triads had like care. I mean, like no one dared to do any crime there, because then you would have like problems with the triads.
Yeah, there's the mafia idea that, the mafia provides a better legal system. I mean, mafia people can understand that you're better off taking 5 or 10% from a prosperous system than just stealing things arbitrarily. There's a great line in the movie Dick Tracy that has all the thugs with their ridiculous faces in the Dick Tracy movie. And they've got this new plan to take over the city. And they basically say, okay, every time anybody gets a haircut, anytime that happens, we're going to take 10%. And that's their plan to do all this evil stuff. Well, basically, it's a sales tax. So, I mean, it's, yeah.
In Taiwan, had been a Japanese colony, the Japanese colony. And so a lot of the landlords were Japanese. And so after the Civil War in China, the nationalists moved over to Taiwan, whose leader was Chiang Kai-shek. The Nationalist Party had been founded by Sun Yat-sen. He wanted land reform for all of China, but he wasn't able to do it. Chiang Kai-shek kind of inherited Sun Yat-sen's idea. So they were able to take the land from the landlords, because they were a lot of Japanese who lost the war. But they compensated them with bonds. Maybe not so much, but something. They got bonds. And so there was a land to the tiller. So the farmers got the land, but that was combined with a tax on the land value. So if they didn't pay the tax, they couldn't keep the land. Right. That actually promoted them to make the best use of their land in order to pay the tax and have something left over. Right. And that was a tax that didn't really hurt production because the land didn't run away. So Taiwan developed very rapidly into their modern economy without much material resources. They don't have oil or iron or anything like that. And so basically export-oriented pro-growth policies.
Now, I wonder if that influenced Deng Xiaoping with the 99-year leases in China. I understand that basically you still had to pay the same amount to the village, but anything else you could keep.
It's the same idea.
Huge incentives, the village gets the same amount, and all of a sudden there's these surpluses everywhere.
Exactly.
Yes?
How would you comment the fact that in non-territorial waters we have many not registered ships that are producing laptops and all different, cameras, stuff that are sold wherever the world.
Are you saying there's factories inside of ships anchored out in the sea?
Where are they? Not only factories, so lots of entertainment and a huge industry on non-registered ships that are,
where is it? North Sea, Mediterranean, where Sea?
North Africa, Mediterranean, yes.
Okay.
And also beyond the Caspic Sea,
Please let us know
the
about
Baltic waters. Yeah.
I can't comment on it, I've never heard of it, but please send me information.
It is documented.
But also documentary.
And there's an effort, David Friedman, the son of David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman, has an institute called Seasteading.
David's son.
Milton Friedman's grandson, Patrick Friedman, has an organization called Seasteading, where he wants to create large platforms in the middle of the ocean that would be stable, and you'd have like a whole city on that platform outside of national jurisdictions.
It's like a Jewel Valley City. It's like a Jewel Valley City.
Yeah, and that's so, and he's getting investors, and they have plans, and I'd like to know more about it.
He wants to build islands.
Island cities. I'd like to know more about these ships that have these.
Because of Jewel Valley.
You can subscribe already.
You can go to the website, Seasteading.
This is Doug Casey for years has been trying to find, he would go to dictators and try and bribe them to buy a chunk of the land to set up the same sort of thing in Asia, and he's been all around the world trying to do this. And he's irritated that these dictators are so stupid, because he says they make much more money getting a percentage of the profits. But yeah, he's trying to get a place where you get better legal institutions, and the challenge is, how secure, it's tough to get a secure, stable place when it's brand new, and who knows what's going to happen. So it's a big challenge, but it's one of the many ways to promote free market ideas, free market reforms, is this idea of city-states, charter cities, and I think it has potential.
But was a documentary by a French reporter, similarly with what Mr. said. From north of Africa, on the ships, they prepare this kind of electronics, and then something like Moroccan guy comes to France, Italy, and selling on the black market. Even computers and all these things. Was on the TV. From a French reporter.
In the Mediterranean?
Yes, on the north of Africa. Awesome.
But it tends not to be, anyway, it's interesting. So lots of options, and the ship technology of ships, a lot of people are buying retirement condos on an ocean liner. So basically, when you retire, you buy this condo on an ocean liner, and you can ride, and it's not part of any country, it just travels around the ocean. You can stay there, you can rent it to friends, but the idea is you're outside of any jurisdiction, other than apart from the jurisdiction of whoever registers the ship. Okay.
There are some examples of those little free zone cities near Beijing. When I say what you presented, it only works if there's dictatorship government to prevent things from happening.
Yeah.
Because three little cities grown outside of Beijing. The first time was near Yangon, the summer palace. And all the artists from all over China kind of just gathered there because there's no government there. And the peasants just rent their house to these artists. There's no electricity, no infrastructure, but just because it's so free and artists are free to produce their art and become really, really famous. And a lot of farmers start going there and eventually live there also because they want to be with the free Chinese people. And then they grow so big and the government just wipe them out one day. And then the second city grow again by all the college graduates. They don't want to go back to the village, but they couldn't get a job in the city. So they started to build their own city. And they have the highest, newest technology and very active. And I think before the Olympic, because it became a threat to the government, the three ideas that they changed there, because everybody was educated over there and got wiped out overnight, all the buildings again. And they built their own buildings and everything. The first thing the government did was cut off the electricity, because modern people could not live without their electricity. So, but the third city is inside of Beijing. not dare to touch is because they're Muslims. All the Muslims from west of China moved to Beijing for job opportunity, but they have homemade bombs and knives. So, and they get really big now and very powerful. Government did not dare to touch them. They have they're all outside the walls in Beijing. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, those are fascinating stories. Yeah, one of the things Paul Romer says in the Charter of Cities is you need a powerful institution. We do have the charter, maybe a Canada or something huge, because if you don't, if it gets too wealthy, the federal just take it over. They just, wipe out the charter.
Even in Sardinia, in Italy, in the middle of Sardinia, you can find some cities where the police don't have any authorities because of the old families. They run the city. No police come there because they are shot or killed. So even today in Sardinia and Europe, there is in this kind of cities.
In Georgia, the two breakaway provinces in Georgia, there's a discussion of how the institutions are developing in those. That there are advantages there because of trade, smuggling, and so forth. And, one of those places would seem to be a candidate for a charter. My proposal was U.S. military bases around the world. A great example from the one in the Philippines that they closed down. Basically, there was an earthquake or something, or a volcano that wrecked the base. They basically sold it. They turned it into a sort of a free trade zone. And with the airport, FedEx was a huge, wealthy, prosperous operation for a time because it had this infrastructure and it was independent. But you look for different models and opportunities for that and a way to attract investors. But you have to handle this problem of if it gets too wealthy, then someone's going to want to come in and take it. In Novgorod, they hired an aristocracy to defend the city. And if they, if they didn't like them, they'd fire them and get a new aristocracy to defend the city. But in the end, they got wiped out by Moscow, so I guess they weren't one of the weak. That's one of the arguments someone made to me is, if these charter cities are so great, the Athens gets conquered by Alexander, the Greek city-states do, Novgorod gets conquered by Moscow. If the city-state idea is so good, how do you prevent yourself from being conquered by the nation-state nearby? And that's a good question, yeah.
Yeah, so we kind of figured out, like, in the past, like, always the problem of free cities was, the always the problem is, like, if you become so successful, some people will try to get rid of you, just destroy the concept. So, would you agree that the internet and, like, the virtualization of society might help to get, like, this decentralized, free society that you have, like, you can do like most of your communication via PGP encrypted methods. You can even have like bitcoins, like non-traceable currency transactions, and you only have to go like to open the counter trades and you really want to receive some material object. So you can have like basically like a parallel society, still using the infrastructure of like existing countries or cities. You can live in New York or Berlin, but then like your contact economics network. And you're totally off the radar. I mean, it's a bit like mafia works.
I would guess that a lot of computer guys in Eastern Europe and Russia are in that sort of system now. They're making lots of money, but the money stays overseas where they're earning their programming work. They don't bring it to their nation state because it would be taxed. And I'm sure there's a fair amount of that going on. And you want to get I don't know the best. It's, the difficulty is you really don't go to computer guys to get the best example of what an ideal culture would be. But I know what you mean about trying to build a virtual society that's independent of these rules and restrictions.
It's already a bit too late because they already established the internet police. The FBI, the Russian secret team.
They come, like, the encryption methods are always like 10 years ahead of government is able to reflect.
There's a great book on that. If anybody's a science fiction reader, Werner Vinge, V-I-N-G-E, has written a series of books just on that. They're very libertarian. They're great. It was influenced by David Friedman, but there's a whole series of them.